Welcome to lecture number 36. Today we are going over historical topic 4.8, Jackson and Federal Power. The theme for the topic is Politics and Power. The learning objective is explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government from 1800 to 1848. The first key concept picks up with the new political parties. It says, by the 1820s and 1830s, new political parties arose, the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson and the Whigs led by Henry Clay, that disagreed about the role and powers of the federal government in issues such as the national bank, tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. The Democrats and the Whigs came about as a result of Jackson's presidency. Jackson splits the Democratic Republicans after he feels wronged in the election of 1824. Later, the Whigs will arise as an opposition to their view of Jackson's tyrannical power. Notable Whigs include Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. The Whigs can be thought of as a nationalist faction of the former Democratic-Republican Party. Henry Clay had proposed his American system that he tried to implement as early as the 1810s when he was in the House of Representatives. The specifics of this plan were covered in lecture number 31, historical topic 4.3. In short, they included higher tariffs, preservation of the Bank of the U.S., and internal improvements. Andrew Jackson believed that the powers of the federal government should be limited as he wanted a smaller government. As a result, he vetoed a lot of bills that would grow the size of the federal government. An example of this is the Maysville Road bill that would create a federally funded road through Kentucky. He had a total of 12 vetoes, regular and pocket vetoes, which was more than all previous presidents combined. He redefined the power of the veto because previously presidents only used it sparingly, giving precedence to the will of Congress. On the issue of slavery, Jackson believed it should be left up to the states if they wanted to allow it, though he did intervene in the issues when abolitionists would try to send abolitionist literature to southern states through U.S. mail. Jackson himself was an enslaver. During his presidency, he would regularly write back to his overseers in his Tennessee plantation to take stock of operations. One of the biggest issues between the Democrats represented by Jackson and the Whigs led by Clay was the Second Bank of the U.S. It was central to Clay's American system, but Jackson had opposed the bank from his very first message to Congress. He railed against it and described it as a hydra or a many-headed monster of corruption. His negative perception of it dates back to the Panic of 1819 that was partially caused by the bank and its tightening of credit. Every year he brings it up in his message to Congress but doesn't actively pursue its end. The Whig Party believed that he was not genuine on his stance against the bank as it had become a stabilizing force in the economy. They believed that Jackson was using the bank to spread a populist message and found the bank to be a convenient symbol that could be vilified to get more votes. So the Whigs convinced the bank president, Nicholas Biddle, to apply to Congress to renew the charter of the bank earlier than needed so as to make it a wedge issue in the 1832 election in which Clay was challenging Jackson. The charter clears Congress, and when it makes it to Jackson's desk, the Whigs realize they had miscalculated Jackson, as he vetoes the bill and writes a veto message that reiterates his previous views. The original charter still had 2 years left, so the veto didn't mean the immediate end to the bank. So the Whigs hoped to win the 1832 election and recharter it in a new congressional term. However, Jackson gains more popularity as a result of the veto and wins re-election. The Whig plan backfired incredibly as the bank was put in a precarious position and Jackson stayed in office. Jackson felt emboldened with the election results and thus plans to finish off killing the bank. Through executive action, Jackson withdraws all the federal deposits from the National Bank and deposits them in several different state banks around the country. These are called the pet banks. The bank, losing the majority of its deposits, is forced to tighten credit and calls in loans again, greatly destabilizing the economy. The bank war and another policy of Jackson's called Specie Circular will cause a financial panic in 1837. Specie Circular was a change in policy that requires the purchase of federal land in the West only to be done with hard currency, that is, coins of gold and silver. The federal government refused to accept banknotes or paper money because paper money in the West was experiencing inflation and depreciating in value. The policy was also to serve as a way to curb speculation on Western land. The policy of Specie Circular made it harder to purchase land and thus keep that speculation to a minimum. While it might have curbed speculation, it also led to bank failures in the West as the federal government's vote of no confidence in their paper currency impacted their ability to do business. The devaluation of paper currency continued further as it was now not possible to buy land with it and created a general rise in prices that led to the Panic of 1837. These two policies proved to be disastrous for the economy. Whenever the financial panic begins, Andrew Jackson is no longer in office to face the political repercussions. It's down to his vice president who wins the election of 1836, Martin Van Buren. The state of the economy will be so severe that he is voted out of office in 1840, with the election of the first Whig president, William Henry Harrison. Tariffs are the next big issue between the two political parties. The Whigs liked tariffs, also part of the American system, and in 1828 they passed the highest tariff to date. It is still the highest tariff that the U.S. has ever had in its history. It was an over 60% added tax on the value of imports. It was dubbed by the South as the Tariff of Abominations because of how expensive it made imported goods. The state of South Carolina challenges the tariff during the nullification crisis. In the nullification crisis, South Carolina politicians, like John C. Calhoun, take the position that if a state ever believes that a federal law is unconstitutional, they have the right to nullify it. Calhoun was at the time Vice President of the United States under Jackson, and resigns to fill the South Carolina Senate seat to defend nullification in Congress. Now, where would South Carolinians get the idea that states could nullify federal law? Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the previous century had penned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts, in which they expand on compact theory. They argued that the states had come together in a compact, and that if they ever felt that this compact was not beneficial to one of them, that they could ignore the offending law or leave the compact. Congress passes the Force Bill, which authorizes Jackson to use military force against South Carolina to force them to pay the tariff. Eventually, the nullification crisis is solved by Henry Clay in Congress with a new compromise tariff that South Carolina agrees to pay. The final issue between the parties is on internal improvements. Again, it's another part of the Whigs' American system. Jackson would not fund projects located solely in one state. The example of this is the Maysville Road, which was going to only be located within the state of Kentucky, which just happens to be the home of Henry Clay. The Whigs favored spending federal money on these internal improvements. They argued that the infrastructure that they provided would help the country grow at a faster rate, and it would help the economy to be stronger and more self-sufficient. The next key concept delves into how Jackson dealt with westward expansion and relations with American Indians. It says, frontier settlers tended to champion expansion efforts, while American Indian resistance led to a sequence of wars and federal efforts to control and relocate American Indian populations. White settlers are starting to move to the southeast of the United States. Settlers are looking for new land as they have exhausted the soil in the southeast and are moving further west towards the Mississippi. As they're moving west, of course, they're running into Native Americans who had been there for generations and had even signed treaties with the United States after armed conflicts, giving them that land. American Indians resist encroachment, sometimes violently by attacking or raiding migrants that cross through Indian land. Early examples of this resistance was seen earlier in the period with Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, or the Prophet. Tecumseh created a confederacy and organized the largest Indian fighting force that the U.S. ever faced. In 1815, Tecumseh is killed in battle, and those resistance efforts die. Through the 1820s, the state of Georgia was trying to push out the Cherokee tribes by creating laws that took away rights of Indians within the state. The Cherokees, who are affected by these laws, get a legal victory in the Supreme Court with the court case Worcester v. Georgia. Ultimately, John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, said that states cannot make laws that affect Native Americans because they are semi-sovereign, and only the federal government has the power to legislate, deal with, or enter into treaties with Native Americans. When Andrew Jackson hears of the decision, he makes no attempt to enforce it. There's a famous anecdote in which Jackson says something to the effect of, "John Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it." That origin of the anecdote is mostly linked to something he wrote to a close friend named John Coffey, and what he said was much worse in terms of the imagery he used. He wrote, "The decision of the Supreme Court has fallen stillborn, and they find that it cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate." He goes on and says that if a coalition was to take place between them, the Indians, and the Georgians, the arm of the government is not sufficiently strong to preserve them from destruction. In 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act. It is an attempt to exchange the land in the southeast with Native Americans for land west of the Mississippi in Oklahoma Territory. The tribes in question here, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Some of them will take the deal early on and suffer the least amount of casualties in trying to move across the southeast. Others, like the Cherokee, wait longer, claiming rightly their ties to the land and are forcibly removed in the 1830s. Between 1831 and 1842, tribes are forcibly removed by a mixture of state militia and U.S. Army regulars. About 60,000 are forcibly moved, and on the trail west, about 15,000 die, giving this ordeal the name the Trail of Tears. Alright, so here's the recap. Jackson's presidency includes issues over tariffs, the Bank of the United States, and Indian removal. And finally, the Trail of Tears was due to coerced removal of the southeastern tribes across the Mississippi. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushlights.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.